Welcome back. On this week's episode of Hot Cocoa, we're going to be taking a look at how we can clean up our code and organize it in a way that makes it more useful and more reusable. And also we're going to take a look at how we can polish up our interface and make it work better. Coming up on Hot Cocoa. So we have our Tweet app, and it has a good number of functions. We can post tweets, we can get our friends' timeline, we can get our the public timeline. And now that we have the basic fundamentals of how it works down, we need to do a bit of cleanup, because unless we clean up our code, then it's going to be a little difficult to reuse it. So let's take a look at the code that we have at the moment. Right now, you'll notice we have a lot of redundancy in our code. Every time we get the friends timeline or get the public timeline, almost all of the code is identical. In fact, all of the code is identical with the exception of the URL string we're getting. We're doing the same thing each time, sending the URL connection and then updating the table view. And in order to make some of that redundancy go away, the best thing to do is create our own class. And this also has the advantage of making our code more reusable, because then we only have to write the code once, and we can use it as many times as we want. We can import it into other projects and use it there. Other applications, other developers can interface with our code and use it in ours, just like we're using the keychain proxy here. And also, another thing we need to clean up is the interface. Like I mentioned in the last episode, right now we only have a get public timeline button and a login button, and we need to have a get friends timeline, get public timeline, and login button. So you don't have to log in every time you want to get your friends timeline, which is a little, that's also more than you need to do. So let's start out by doing that. First, let's change this from get public timeline to just public timeline, and we'll shrink this a bit, and we'll shrink this a bit to make room for the new button. If we go to tools and library and button and drop our new button right in there. Now ideally these would be the same size, this button and this button, but for now just leave it as is. Friends timeline. There we go. And now that we have that, we can save this, and we'll close Interface Builder for now. We'll need to relink it, but we'll save that for after we get all our code ready. So in order to create our own class, it's basically the same as how we made App Controller, except this time we're going to put it in its own folder, or what Xcode calls groups. I'm not sure why it calls them groups. They're just really folders. But I guess since they're not really folders on the hard drive, they wanted to call it something else. Anyway, we're going to call it Twitter Engine. There we go. And within that folder or group, going to, not new project. We want to create a new file and an Objective-C class, and we're going to call it HC Twitter engine. And the reason I'm prefixing it with HC is because it's sort of tradition, if you will, if you can call it that, that when you create your own classes, especially if there's going to be a group of classes, it's always good practice to prefix them with something that identifies them as yours. Like this is EM keychain, and you have NS and whatever NS string, NS data, which stands for next step. In this case, this stands for Hot Cocoa. So we have the Hot Cocoa Twitter engine, and we'll create that. And right now, all we have is an empty M file and an empty header file. And notice this is a subclass of NS object, but it's fine because we're just not going to be using anything from it. So let's take a look at what we need. A lot of the code redundancy comes from the fact that we're doing a lot of this connecting and loading the data in all multiple times. So let's separate some of that out. First, let's have we're going to make two InnoString variables. Another one, InnoString password. And we're going to use these to store the user's username and password so that they only have to enter it once. And the nice thing about it is that when we instantiate, I can never pronounce that word right, but we create an instance of this class, it'll remember those variables whenever we reuse that instance. So we have our two there and some methods. We're going to have methods that return InnosData, because this is what we get back when we send a connection to Twitter. We get it back as InnosData, which we're then going to feed to the timeline. And we're going to have it it's called getFriendsTime timeline. And another one, again, returning InnosData. getPublicTimeline. And another one, also doing InnosData, returning InnosData. And that'll be called send update. And this will take the argument as an InnoString, and we're going to put that in status. And then a method that returns void, which set username InnoString user and pass InnoString. There we go. And then we can copy all of these, paste them into our im file. There we go. And just create our brackets. Remember to remove that semicolon. There we go. And there, and one more time. There we go. Now really, all we have to do is cut and paste code from the controller into here. So for example, for our getFriendsTimeline, let's see, here we go, getFriendsTimeline for username. We're going to take the code beginning with the URL string here and ending with right here before we go and load the data into the timeline. Just take all this, copy it, paste it into here. Now there are a few things that we need to change. One of them is, let's see, actually we don't need to change that because it's already in the username and password. But we also, first of all, this needs to return nil. It has to return, normally in the other one, since the method didn't return anything, I believe it was a void method, was it? Yes, it returned void. So it didn't matter that this didn't return anything, it just said return, which basically means if something goes wrong, since this is error checking code, if something goes wrong, stop running the method and then go back to whatever you were doing before. But here, since it's expecting it to return something, we have to tell it to return nil, which basically means if something goes wrong, then it just won't return anything, and it'll display an error. But if something doesn't go wrong, then we still need to return something, because before we were just taking the code directly and putting that into the timeline. Well, now we need to take the URL data and set it up as return data, and that's going to take the URL data that we got back from the connection and return it back to wherever this code was to begin with. You can think of it as sort of acting like a substitute. Like when you call this method, it's as if you were returning this data. It's as if you were entering the data directly, except there's code behind it that's doing it for you instead of just typing a number in. So we have that set up, and now we need to do the same for getPublicTimeline, which, where is that? Here, there it is. And again, from where the init string is down to the end of that URL data error check encode. And again, we'll paste this into get public timeline, make this return nil, and make this return URL data. And by the way, it actually, if we left this as return, it would compile, but it would give you an error, or not an error, it would give you a warning. So it's best just to fix the warning, because ideally, even though the code will compile and run with warnings, warnings generally mean that something could happen in the future if something went unexpectedly, and it's just a good idea to try and aim for having no errors or warnings in your code, and that way your code will be more reliable. So let's see, we also have our send update, which send update right here, and again we'll copy this from status down to here, which is pretty much the whole thing except for the progress part, and paste that into here. And I don't believe there's anything we need to change. Nope, there's not. You'll see it accepts an init string as an argument, and it puts that into our status variable here, which, since that already exists, we don't need to create it, so we can do that. Actually, we can just remove that whole line there, because that line, it got status. If we look back here, that was the line that took it from the text field and put it into status. But since we're accepting that as an argument, we don't need that line anymore. So we just start out with the trim text, make sure it's not too long, and then send the request. And then finally, we have the set username and password method, which is really simple. All it does is take that and set it to username, and take the password and set it to password. Oops, I have that backwards. Password is equal to pass, and then username is equal to user. There we go. Because what we're doing is we're taking what gets passed in as an argument and setting that to the variables that we defined up here. So now that we have our engine done, that code is done, we need to clean up the code in App Controller, which basically means we can delete what we have, or what we just took out and put in the other one. So we'll get rid of that. We will get rid of all of this. And public timeline, we'll get rid of all of this up to the timeline XML. Now you'll notice there's still redundancy here. The code that loads data into the timeline is the same. And this is where our new method that we're going to write for here comes in. Let's see, it's going to return void, and we're going to call it, let's see, set, or I guess it would be set timeline, or here, let's call it update timeline with data, and we'll pass in an initData object. Oops. And I'm naming that URL data so it's compatible with the code we already have. And you always want to make sure your method names actually make sense. For example, this should have an L in it, and this update timeline with data, which tells you what it does. It updates the timeline with the data you're going to pass into it. So we'll take that and we'll just, for ease, it doesn't matter what order these are in compared to how they're listed here. So we'll just put it at the top to make it easier to find. Do that in there, and then we will take the code from timeline up to timeline reload data, and we will paste that into our update timeline with data. There we go. And that's all we have to do, because it takes the URL data, puts it in the timeline, and then updates it. Which means we can now get rid of that code from here. So get rid of that, get rid of all these these extra spaces, and get rid of this again. Now you'll notice our get friends timeline and our get public timeline are looking rather sparse. And let's take this moment to change this up a bit. We don't need this to be a void function anymore. What we need it is to be an IB action, because we're going to link it to the button. So change that to IB action. Oops. And just get rid of all of that. So we have a get friends timeline, and we need it to be ID sender. And also in the header, change that up here. IB action get friends timeline. Oops, ID sender. There we go. Okay, and we'll get rid of this one. So now if we go back here, our get friends timeline and our get public timeline are looking pretty sparse. And what we need to do is we need to call the Twitter engine to get the data first, and then call the method that we just wrote to put the data into the timeline view. But before we can call the Twitter engine, we need to instantiate it, or create an instance of it. And we're going to do that in the login code, which is right here, our end login window. And you'll see before this called our get friends timeline for username, which it will still do, but it will do in a different fashion. What we're going to do is we're going to create, first of all, we can create a new, actually before we even do that, let's go to our header file here, and we need to import the hc Twitter engine.h, and then let's save all of these so the auto completion will work. Save and save. Alright. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a new place to put the object. So we want to create, just like we're creating a string or any other kind of object, hc Twitter engine, and we're going to call our object Twitter engine without the hc, so we know the difference between them. And then we need to alloc and init that, so we have Twitter engine equals hc Twitter engine alloc and init. There we go. And now that we actually have an object that we can work with, we need to call the where is it? Well, first we need to do the set username. So let's do that. We'll do Twitter engine set username, and our username will be username field string value. And if you want to jump to the other like little highlighted section right here, you hold down Control and hit the backslash or forward slash. I can never remember which is which. It's the one to the left of the Shift key below the question mark if you're on a US keyboard. Anyway, we'll call that pass field string value and close up all our brackets there. So now the username and password is set for that instance. So if we ever reuse that instance, then we don't need to do it again. Actually, that reminds me, this needs to not be here. This needs to be up here. Because the problem is, if we left that here, then it would throw away that object as soon as it was done this method, which we don't want because we're going to need that object later. So we'll create it up here in the header, which means it'll be valid as long as our program is running, and then we'll initialize it here because we don't need to use up the memory until we really need to, and then set the username. And because we have it set up here, we can reuse the same engine in any method we want, and it'll remember that the username and password that we set to it. So we still want it to update the friends timeline, but now we're going to do it by calling our Twitter engine method. So if we have our update timeline with data, do self update timeline with data, and remember how I said when you do this, it's sort of like as if you were putting in the value directly, except there's code behind it. So if we have our Twitter engine get friends, oops, there we go. Our get friends timeline. It's as if we were putting the data directly into this method, except for we're using method to get the data. We're just putting it in its place. So we have that set up, and then we can actually just take this right there and paste that into there, and then paste that into there, except for changing this to public. And then for here, all we need to do is take our Twitter engine and send update, and we will send the string. Need to remember what that one is called. Text field. It's called update text. So we want our string to be update text string value. There we go. Now, with some luck, and once we link that button, so go back and link the button. Oops, not drag the button. Let's try linking the button. There we go. And we'll link that to get friends timeline, and everything else should be the same. We run this, and we wait for it to compile. Let's see, what are our errors? Where are our errors? Error undefined in this function. Oh, oopsies. Let's see, where is that? Data error. I forgot some code. There's our error. This here also needs to be in there, because otherwise we're sending it to a place that doesn't exist. And what is wrong here? Control reaches end of non-void function. This is where we need to change it. This here, which you'll notice is under send update. This needs to be username, and this needs to be password. I know we had to change that once, but I was thinking it was up in the friends timeline, which it isn't, because those are already variables. So we'll change that. That should take care of all the errors, and then this needs to return URL data also, which I forgot to add. Being able to interpret weird messages like control reaches end of non-void function is important, because what that means is it got to the end of the function and it suddenly realized, hey, wait a second, this function is supposed to return something, but it never calls return, so it's not returning anything. So it's just like, hey, you need to do something. So we'll save that and save that, and let's try this again. Our error went away. There we go, and it runs. And we'll try to log in here. Go. And yes, as you can see, it's already in the keychain. And we'll log in. And ta-da! There's our timeline. And we can go get the public timeline. Then we can go back and get our friends timeline. And there's also a few other things, like the buttons don't move with the window. We would want to change that. And also, if you click on the login button, once you log in, the little spinner doesn't show up. So there's still a few more things to tidy up, but that's most of it. We got most of it done, right? So that's all for this week's episode of Hot Cocoa. We'll see you next week on our new date, which is Monday. And we'll have the code out. I don't know what it is yet, because I haven't decided what we're doing yet. I think we may be doing drag and drop, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do that as a whole episode or as a Cocoa Tip. So we may be doing that next week. I'll have the code posted by the end of the week so you guys can take a look at it. Read over and see if there's anything you don't understand, anything you want me to make sure that I explain what's going on, and then by the time the episode that comes out, I will make sure to clear up any confusion there may be with the code. So see you next week. on hot cocoa.